Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. You know, the Old Testament, it's packed with stories that just grab you. And today we're taking a close look at one that, well, it really captures this back and forth between humanity and the divine, the Book of Judges. And we're going deep with the King James Version, really unpacking what it tells us about faith, leadership, and the consequences of our choices.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating period in Israel's history. It's right after the conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua, but before the establishment of the monarchy. So no king, lots of turmoil. And well, let's just say there are some pretty vivid lessons in there for us, even today.
Exactly. So picture this. The Israelites, they finally made it to the land God promised them, but then things get really complicated.
That's putting it mildly. They go through this cycle over and over. They turn away from God. They get conquered by their neighbors. They cry out for help. God raises up a judge to save them. And then, well, they do it all over again.
It's like they just can't break free from this pattern, like a bad habit. So these judges, we hear that term and think, oh, courtrooms, laws, judgments. But these figures were something entirely different, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, sure, they were leaders, but think more along the lines of, well, divinely appointed heroes almost. I mean, there were military leaders, prophets, even just charismatic individuals that God empowered to rescue Israel from its enemies.
It says it right there in Judges 2.16. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. They weren't settling legal disputes. They were fighting for Israel's survival. And even then, as Gideon says in chapter 8, it's God who ultimately rules. He's the true king, the real authority.
Right, and that's a key point, because the whole book is really wrestling with this question of God's sovereignty, of his right to rule, and Israel's, let's say, inconsistent loyalty to that role. It makes you wonder who wrote this book and when. Tradition points to the prophet Samuel, but the actual authorship, well, it's still debated. What makes people think Samuel wrote it, and why might that not be the case?
That's a great question. Well, Samuel was a pretty important figure during that transitional period. He's a prophet, a leader, seems like someone who'd be in a position to document these events. But there's that repeated line in the book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. You find it in several chapters, 17, 18, 19, 21. It kind of suggests the author was writing from a time when there was a king, looking back on this period.
Right, so that would point to it being written after the monarchy was established. But then you have that part in the first chapter, verse 21, about the Jebusites still holding Jerusalem. And David captured Jerusalem, right? So some scholars say that means the book had to be written before that, maybe around 1000 BC. But then there's this feeling in some of the later chapters, this sense of societal breakdown, of moral decline, like it's describing a time after the Davidic dynasty was already in place, maybe as a way of looking back and saying, see, things were even worse before.
It's almost like trying to fit puzzle pieces together.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the book wasn't written all at once. Perhaps different sections come from different times. Like maybe some parts were based on older stories or traditions, but then compiled later during the monarchy. And that bit about Jerusalem, well, maybe that situation just lingered for a while, even after other areas had a king. What seems clear is that the author's trying to teach something about the past, maybe less about exact dates, more about the lessons for those living under the monarchy.
That makes sense. So if we dive into those lessons, what stands out to you? I mean, what's the core message here?
Well, it's about loyalty, isn't it? It's about remembering what God has done for you, staying true to your commitments, and recognizing that ultimately God is in control.
Exactly. The central theme is this. God is the rightful ruler of Israel. He established that through the covenant at Sinai, a promise and a commitment. But Israel, well, they had a habit of forgetting that. They'd turn away from God, embrace the Canaanite culture, worship their gods, even adopt their ways of living. And that's when trouble started.
And it's not just a one-time slip-up, right? It's this cycle, as we said. Chapters 2.1119 and Nehemiah 9.2631 paint this picture vividly. It's almost like they get comfortable, forget the past, and start chasing after the shiny things their neighbors have. And God, well, he allows consequences to follow. They get conquered, oppressed. And it's only when they cry out in desperation that he raises up a judge to deliver them. Makes you think, doesn't it, about how easily we can fall into the same traps.
It really does. It's that tendency to forget past blessings, to take things for granted. And the book highlights another interesting element. It's not all doom and gloom. Even in this time of failure, there's this powerful presence of the Holy Spirit. It's like God doesn't give up on them, even when they mess up. Look at Othniel, Gideon, Jephthah, even Samson. They're all empowered by God's Spirit to do amazing things. You see it in verses like Judges 3.10, 6.34, 11.29, and Throughout Samson's story, it's almost like even in our weakest moments, God can still work through us. Is it that God's just choosing whoever's around, even if they're not exactly saints, or is there something deeper going on?
That's a great question. I think it shows that God's commitment to his people isn't dependent on their perfection. It's about grace, about fulfilling his promises, even when we stumble. And it reminds us that true leadership, true power comes from God, not from our own abilities or righteousness.
Right. It's like in the New Testament where it says God chooses the weak things to shame the strong. It's a reminder that God's power can work through anyone, regardless of their flaws. Okay, so we touched on dating the book of Judges earlier. Our source highlights how tricky it is to pin down exact dates.
Yeah, there's that system based on 1 Kings 6.1, which says there are 480 years between the Exodus and Solomon's fourth year as king. That would place the period of Judges somewhere around 1380 to 1050 BC. And Jephthah, in Judges 11.26, talks about Israel holding Heshbon for 300 years, which sort of lines up with that time frame. Plus, there's the Merneptah still, an Egyptian inscription from around 1210 BC that actually mentions Israel.
Yeah.
So they were definitely in Canaan by then. But is it that simple?
Well, there's another view. Some scholars think that 480-year number might be more symbolic, like 12 judges, each ruling for 40 years, representing a generation. The book of Judges does use a lot of round numbers, 10, 20, 40, 80 years. It's almost like they're signifying a complete period or significant length of time rather than trying to be super precise. And if the Exodus happened later than traditionally thought, well, that would shorten the whole period of the Judges. So we have some clues, but a really specific timeline that's still debated. These round numbers, like 40 years, what do they really mean? Literal years? A generation? Just a long time?
It's a good question. Ancient Near Eastern literature often used round numbers to convey a sense of completeness or significance, not necessarily literal accuracy as we understand it today. Especially the number 40. It pops up a lot in the Bible, often connected to testing, change, or a significant experience. So some of the time frames in Judges might reflect real durations. But it's also possible the author's using them symbolically to highlight the recurring patterns of Israel's history during this era. It's more about the message, the lesson, than getting the dates exactly right.
Makes sense. So how about the structure of the book itself? Our source outlines a threefold division, which I think is really helpful in understanding the whole story. You have the prologue in the first 3 chapters, then the main section, chapters 3 through 16, and finally the epilogue in the last 5 chapters. This isn't just random, right? This structure is carefully crafted to build a narrative and deliver a message.
Totally agree. And within that prologue, you've got 2 parts. The first part, chapters 1 and 2 up to verse 5, sets the scene. It describes Israel's early victories in Canaan, but also their big failures to fully drive out the Canaanites. God even rebukes them for it. It's interesting how this part isn't strictly chronological. Why would the author start with this kind of mixed bag of success and failure and not even in the order it happened?
That's a good observation. Maybe it's to foreshadow the whole book's message. Like, right from the start, the author's highlighting the missed opportunities, the seeds of future problems. By putting these early events together, even out of order, it shows that the struggles during the time of the Judges weren't just random events. They were a consequence of incomplete obedience, of not finishing the job God gave them. It sets the stage for the pattern of disobedience that plays out again and again.
That makes a lot of sense. Then you have the second part of the prologue, chapter 2, verse 6 to chapter 3, verse 6. This part takes a broader view, covering the whole period from Joshua's death to the rise of the monarchy. And this is where that cyclical nature we talked about really comes into focus. It's Israel turning away, getting oppressed, crying out, and being rescued over and over. And you start seeing those key phrases that'll echo through the book. Did evil in the sight of the Lord, he sold them into the hand of. It's setting the template for the stories that follow.
Exactly. And then in the main body of the book, chapters 3 through 16, you get those specific accounts of the Judges. Each story follows a similar pattern, often starting with Israel's rebellion, then their suffering, and finally the rescue thanks to the judge God raises up. Othniel's story, in chapter 3, verses 7 through 11, it's like a blueprint, a report form, as our source puts it, that many of the other narratives follow.
And then you have the individual stories of the major judges. Ehud, the left-handed guy from the tribe of Benjamin, who outsmarts the Moabites. Deborah, the prophetess and judge, leading Barak to victory against the Canaanites. Our source highlights Gideon and his son Abimelech, chapters 6 through 9, as being especially important. Gideon's like the ideal judge. He recognizes God's authority, humbly submits to his will. But Abimelech, he's the opposite. Power-hungry, rejects God's rule, wants to be king himself. The way these stories are arranged, it's deliberate.
You're right, it's not random. Putting Gideon and Abimelech, who represent this clash between worshiping the Canaanite god Baal and submitting to the one true God, right in the middle, and then surrounding them with stories like Deborah's and Jephthah's and further out with Ehud and Samson, it emphasizes the central conflict: who's really in charge? Who does Israel ultimately owe allegiance to? It's like the author is building an argument through these narratives.
And then we get to the epilogue, chapters 17 through 21. It's a shift in focus. Instead of individual judges, it's showing the overall state of things during this era. And it's not pretty. There's religious corruption, moral decay at every level. Individuals, cities, entire tribes. What's interesting is these events probably happened earlier in the period of Judges, so why put them at the end?
It's like a punch in the gut, right? You go through all these stories of heroes and victories, and then boom, this is what happens when you consistently reject God. It's chaos, anarchy, the breakdown of society. By ending with these bleak examples, the author's making a point. This is what happens when there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes, as the book says. It makes the case for why the monarchy, especially David's reign, was seen as a better time.
And it's not just implied, right? The author explicitly connects these events to the monarchy with that phrase, "In those days there was no king in Israel." It's a direct comparison. And there's another subtle detail. Both times, leadership is assigned to the tribe of Judah, once at the very beginning, when they're trying to conquer Canaan, and again later, when dealing with the tribe of Benjamin. It's almost foreshadowing the Davidic line, hinting at a future king from Judah who will bring lasting peace and establish a true kingdom.
You're picking up on those details. It's like a hidden thread running through the whole book. Now, the epilogue itself has two parts. Chapters 17 and 18 tell the story of Micah. He creates his own personal religion, a mix of different traditions, kind of a messed up version of worship. And then you have the tribe of Dan migrating, looking for land, and they adopt Micah's corrupted religion. They're just looking for something to believe in, I guess, but it leads them down a bad path.
And then chapters 19 through 21. This is the story of the Levite and what happens in Gibeah, in the territory of Benjamin. It's a horrific incident, really disturbing. It leads to this massive conflict where the other tribes almost wipe out the entire tribe of Benjamin. It's dark, and it shows how deep the problems ran during this time. You have these horrific stories in the epilogue, and our source points out how they're structured similarly. Both involve a Levite traveling, both mention around 600 warriors, and both end with a tribal area being emptied, Dan in the north and then Benjamin in the center.
It's more than just coincidence, right? Those parallels highlight how widespread the corruption was. It shows a society fracturing, losing its moral compass. And it's even more significant when you consider where those corrupt tribes, Benjamin and Dan, fit into the bigger picture.
That's what I was just thinking. The very tribes that produced heroes like Ehud and Samson, they're the ones shown as deeply corrupt in the epilogue. And these stories about Benjamin and Dan, they frame the central narrative of Gideon and Abimelech. It's like the author's saying, even those capable of great things can fall prey to the same temptations, the same societal decay.
It's a powerful message. So when we step back and look at the book of Judges as a whole, it's a picture of an era gone wrong. A time when, as the book repeats, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. It shows what happens when people forget God, abandon their commitments, and choose their own way. It's a warning, but also a testament to God's mercy. He doesn't abandon his people completely. He sends deliverers, offers second chances. But it's a tough period, a time of waiting for something better.
Absolutely. The book of Judges gives us this raw, honest look at a period in Israel's history marked by this back and forth between faithfulness and apostasy. It shows the consequences of rejecting God's rule and the need for guidance, for deliverance, even when that comes through imperfect human leaders.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, think about what we've explored. This cycle of disobedience, oppression, cries for help, and God raising up deliverers. The tension between Israel's wavering loyalty and God's steadfast faithfulness. And how the book itself is structured to highlight the consequences of rejecting God's authority.
And ask yourself, how do these ancient struggles resonate with our lives today? What are the foreign gods we might be tempted to chase after? What happens when we compromise our values, abandon our principles? The book of Judges, even though it's thousands of years old, it has something to say to us now. It reminds us that we need guidance, we need deliverance, just like the Israelites did.
And maybe, just maybe, it can help us avoid falling into the same traps they did. That's something to think about, isn't it? What are the temptations, the pressures, the foreign gods that might pull us away from what we know is right, what we believe in? And how can we learn from the past, from the stories in this book, to navigate those challenges? It's a question worth wrestling with long after we sign off today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the book of Judges. It's been a journey, hasn't it?
It really has. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking wisdom wherever you can find it.